The Texas heat didn't care about grief. It shimmered off the hood of the black hearse like a fever dream as they lowered Hank Carter into the red earth. Evelyn stood as still as the live oaks surrounding the family plot. At 58, her face was a map of 25 years of ranching, lines carved by sun, wind, and laughter. But today, the laughter was dead. The mourners were a sea of Stetsons and floral dresses, but her eyes kept drifting to the three figures standing apart from the crowd. Jason, Melissa, and Kyle. Hank's biological children. They stood in a perfect line, like statues carved from ice, their eyes hidden behind expensive sunglasses. They hadn't cried. They hadn't touched the casket. They looked like they were standing in line at a bank, waiting for a teller to call their number. An hour later, the ranch was silent. The cloying scent of funeral lilies fought with the smell of dry hay. Evelyn walked into Hank's office. It was a room of dark wood and secrets. For 25 years, this was the engine room. Hank handled the money, Evelyn handled the land. It was a partnership she thought was built on granite. She found the first crack in the foundation that evening. A letter from Bishop and Thorne, a Dallas firm specializing in asset recovery. Demand for payment, $287,500. Evelyn felt the floor tilt. They had no debts. The cattle were sold, the equipment was paid off, and the land had been in her family for 4 generations. She searched for the key to the heavy metal filing cabinet. When she found it taped under the desk, she didn't realize she was unlocking the door to her own destruction. Inside were folders labeled with the names of the 3 people at the funeral. Thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands, transferred monthly. Loans taken against the North Pasture to fund Jason's failing luxury condos in Houston. A second mortgage on the farmhouse to pay for Melissa's alimony battle. Equipment liens to bail Kyle out of a tech startup that never started. Then, she found the new will. Notarized 18 months ago. It wasn't the document they had signed together with old Jim Barnett. This one was a surgical strike. It reclassified the ranch as Hank's separate property, bequeathing his 50% share to his children and leaving Evelyn with a $50,000 pittance and a right to reside, provided she could pay the debts he'd racked up. He hadn't just died. He had erased her. 3 days later, the convoy arrived. A Lincoln Navigator leading a BMW and a rental. They didn't knock, they walked in like they owned the place. Evelyn, Jason said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He was a man who wore a $2,000 suit to a ranch. We've seen the books. It's a mess. Dad was generous to a fault. But the debts are attached to the land now. Our land. Melissa leaned against the kitchen counter, her eyes tracing the cracks in the linoleum with disgust. The taxes alone on 5,000 acres will eat you alive, Evelyn. We've already spoken to a developer. They want to turn the riverfront into a luxury RV resort. It's the only way to clear the debt. This land belongs to the Carters, Evelyn said, her voice shaking with a cold, vibrating rage. We are the Carters, Kyle snapped, looking up from his phone. You're just the woman he married after Mom left. You've had 25 years of a free ride. It's over. Evelyn looked out the window. Luis, her foreman, was standing by the barn, his hand resting on the hilt of a fence tool. He knew. The whole town knew. The vultures were here to strip the carcass. Get out, Evelyn said. Jason smiled, a thin, predatory curve of the lips. We'll be back with a court order, Evelyn. You have 30 days to vacate or buy out our interest. And we both know you don't have $30, let alone $3 million. The big firms in Fort Worth wouldn't touch her. They saw the separate property clause and the signed notarized documents and saw a losing battle. It's a clean will, Mrs. Carter, one suit told her. In Texas, a man can do what he wants with his separate property. She was driving back, defeated, when she saw a small sign near the courthouse, Sofia Reyes, Law and Advocacy. The office was a converted storefront. Sofia was younger than Evelyn's youngest niece, with eyes that looked like they had seen too much too soon. She didn't offer Evelyn coffee or sympathy. She offered a yellow legal pad and a pen. "Tell me everything," Sofia said. "And don't leave out the parts that make you look bad." For 2 hours, Evelyn spoke. She talked about the land, the secret accounts, and the way Jason had looked at her, as if she were a squatter. Sofia looked at the bank statements. Her eyes narrowed. "Look at the dates, Evelyn. These loans from Lone Star Capital Partners. They always hit the account 3 days before Jason's company, Carter Development, filed for bankruptcy protection. And look at the interest rate. 18%? That's not a bank loan. That's a shark bite." "What does it mean?" Evelyn asked. "It means your husband wasn't just being generous," Sofia whispered, "he was being bled. And I think the people holding the knife were his own children. We aren't going to fight this on sentiment, Evelyn. We're going to fight this on fraud." The legal war began with a flurry of motions. Sofia filed for an injunction to stop the sale of the ranch, citing undue influence and breach of fiduciary duty. The stepchildren retaliated by freezing the ranch's operating accounts. By the second month, Evelyn couldn't buy feed. The cattle were beginning to lose weight, their ribs showing through their hides like the bars of a cage. One morning, the sheriff arrived. Not to arrest her, but to serve a notice. Jason had filed for an emergency receivership. He wanted a court-appointed stranger to take over the ranch. "They're trying to starve you out," Sofia said, arriving at the ranch with a trunk full of files and her own sleeping bag. "If they get a receiver, they'll sell the cattle by Tuesday and the land by Friday. We have to go to the source of the money." Sofia worked by lamplight in the guest room. She discovered that Lone Star Capital Partners wasn't a bank. It was a shell company registered in Delaware. The money trail was a labyrinth of LLCs and offshore holdings. Meanwhile, the town of Sterling began to wake up. They had watched Evelyn work the land for decades. They had seen her at every bake sale, every funeral, every drought. One night, a trailer full of hay appeared in the barn. Then a check for the electric bill arrived, signed by a friend. "They can freeze the bank," Louise told her, "but they can't freeze the neighbors." The turning point happened in a windowless conference room in Dallas. Sofia sat across from Jason Carter. A court reporter's machine clicked rhythmically in the corner. Jason was smug. He had 3 lawyers in charcoal suits. Sofia had a stack of papers and a cheap briefcase. "Mr. Carter," Sofia began. "You claim these loans were to help your father?" "Dad wanted to see us succeed," Jason said smoothly. "Then why?" Sofia pulled a document from the bottom of her stack. "Is your signature listed as the authorized agent for Lone Star Capital Partners?" The room went deathly silent. Jason's lead lawyer reached for the paper, his hand trembling slightly. "This is a mistake," Jason stammered. I was just an advisor." "You were the lender," Sofia's voice was like a whip. "You loaned your father money at usurious rates, knowing he couldn't pay it back. You then used that debt to force him to change his will, effectively selling the ranch to yourself through a shell company to bypass community property laws. That's not an inheritance, Mr. Carter. That's racketeering." Jason looked at the camera recording the deposition. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor. The final hearing wasn't a grand trial. It was a slaughter. Faced with the evidence of fraud, the new will was thrown out by the judge as a product of criminal conspiracy. The stepchildren were given a choice: sign over all claims to the ranch and pay back the drained accounts, or face a grand jury for wire fraud and elder abuse. They signed. They left the courthouse without looking at Evelyn, disappearing into the Dallas traffic like the shadows they were. Evelyn returned to the Lazy E as the first clouds and months began to gather. She stood on the porch with Sofia. "You saved it," Evelyn said. "No," Sofia replied, looking out at Luis and the neighbors mending the south fence. "The land saved itself. It just needed someone to read the fine print." As the first drops of rain hit the red dust, Evelyn felt the weight of 25 years of Mrs. Carter fall away. She wasn't just a widow. She was the owner. She was the legacy. And for the first time in a long time, the air smelled like a beginning. No, Sofia replied, looking out at Luis and the neighbors mending the south fence. The land saved itself. It just needed someone to read the fine print. Sofia Reyes didn't move into the main house. She claimed the old foreman's cottage, a small stone building that smelled of cedar and old maps. She turned the dining table into a war room. Cardboard boxes from the bank sat stacked against the walls, and the windows were taped with flowcharts drawn in red and black marker. Hank wasn't just losing money, Evelyn, Sofia said one night, her face pale under the glow of a desk lamp. He was being hunted. She pointed to a diagram on the wall. It showed the connections between the stepchildren's various failing businesses and a central node labeled LSC, Lone Star Capital. Every time Jason's real estate firm in Houston faced a foreclosure, Hank took out a loan from LSC to cover him. But look at the interest. It was compounding monthly. By the time Hank died, he didn't own the North Pasture anymore, he was basically a tenant on his own land. And the person who signed the LSC incorporation papers? A man named Marcus Thorne. The lawyer, Evelyn whispered. The one who sent the first letter. Exactly. It's a closed loop. They were using your husband's guilt and his fading health to cannibalize the ranch from the inside out. The first major battle took place in a crowded courtroom in Fort Worth. Jason, Melissa, and Kyle sat on the right side of the aisle, flanked by a team of 5 lawyers from a top-tier firm. They looked like they were attending a corporate merger. Evelyn sat alone behind Sofia, her hands folded in her lap, wearing her only black suit. The stepchildren's lead attorney, a man named Sterling Vance, stood with an air of bored confidence. Your Honor, this is a simple probate matter. The decedent, Henry Carter, exercised his right to dispose of his separate property. The widow is effectively an interloper attempting to block a legitimate transfer of assets to his biological heirs. We ask for the immediate appointment of a receiver to manage the ranch's mounting debts. Sofia stood up. She looked small against the mahogany bench, but her voice didn't waver. Your Honor, we are not contesting the right to bequeath property. We are contesting the existence of that property as separate. We have evidence that community funds, Evelyn Carter's inheritance from her own parents, were commingled to pay the very debts Mr. Vance is using as an excuse to seize the land. She produced a stack of bank records. Furthermore, we allege undue influence. We have medical records from Hank Carter's doctor showing a diagnosis of early-onset vascular dementia 6 months before the new will was signed. He wasn't of sound mind, and he was being coached by his creditors, who also happened to be his children. The judge leaned forward, peering over his spectacles. Vascular dementia? Mr. Vance, were you aware of this diagnosis? Vance's poise slipped for a fraction of a second. We believe those records are being interpreted loosely by opposing counsel, Your Honor. Interpret them on your own time, the judge snapped. Injunction granted. No one touches a blade of grass on the lazy until we get to the bottom of this. The victory was short-lived. A week later, the physical war began. Evelyn was woken at 3 a.m. by the sound of frantic barking. She ran to the porch to see the horizon glowing orange. The hay barn, the one filled with the donated feed from the neighbors, was a towering pillar of fire. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the barn was a blackened skeleton. 500 bales of hay, gone. It wasn't an accident, Luis said, kicking at a charred piece of wood that smelled faintly of accelerant. Someone cut the fence on the north side, too. 20 head of cattle are missing. Evelyn felt a cold, hollow space opening in her chest. This was the gritty reality of a legal fight. When they couldn't win in the courtroom, they tried to break her spirit on the ground. She walked to her truck, grabbed her rifle from the rack, and looked at Sofia, who had come out wrapped in a blanket. They think because I'm a widow, I'm soft, Evelyn said, her voice like grinding stones. They're about to find out that this land has more iron in it than they do. It wasn't an accident, Luis said, kicking at a charred piece of wood that smelled faintly of accelerant. Someone cut the fence on the north side, too. 20 head of cattle are missing. Evelyn felt a cold, hollow space opening in her chest. This was the gritty reality of a legal fight. When they couldn't win in the courtroom, they tried to break her spirit on the ground. She walked to her truck, grabbed her rifle from the rack, and looked at Sofia, who had come out wrapped in a blanket. "They think because I'm a widow, I'm soft," Evelyn said, her voice like grinding stones. "They're about to find out that this land has more iron in it than they do." Vance called Sofia the next morning. His tone had changed from bored to desperate. "My clients are prepared to offer a settlement. Mrs. Carter keeps the house and 10 acres. The rest of the ranch is sold to clear the debts, and the remaining cash is split 50-50. Evelyn sat in the war room, listening to the call on speaker. "Tell them," Evelyn whispered to Sofia, "that I'll see them in court. And tell Jason I'm not just coming for the land anymore. I'm coming for everything he's stolen from the people of this county." The air in the Dallas conference room was thin and smelled of expensive floor wax and recycled oxygen. Jason Carter sat at the head of the mahogany table, looking every bit the high-powered developer in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than Evelyn's first tractor. But his eyes were restless, darting toward the digital camera mounted on a tripod in the corner. Sofia Reyes smoothed out her suit jacket. She had no team of paralegals. She had one battered leather briefcase and a stack of folders. Evelyn sat directly across from Jason. She didn't look at the lawyers, she stared straight at her stepson. She wanted him to feel the weight of the 25 years he was trying to erase. "Mr. Carter," Sofia began, her voice deceptively soft. "You've stated under oath that your father, Henry Carter, initiated the change in his will because he felt the ranch was separate property that belonged solely to his bloodline. Is that correct?" "That's what he told us," Jason said, leaning back with a practiced, casual air. "He was a traditionalist. He wanted the Carter name to stay with the land." "A traditionalist," Sofia repeated. She pulled a document from her folder. "Then why did he spend 25 years paying the ranch's property taxes from a joint account he shared with Evelyn? An account funded largely by her own inheritance?" "My father handled the books," Jason said, his jaw tightening. "I didn't micromanage his household." "Let's talk about your management then." Sofia leaned forward. "Let's talk about Lone Star Capital Partners. You testified in your initial affidavit that you had no functional or ownership interest in the entity that held the liens against your father's ranch. Do you stand by that?" "I do." Sofia slid a printed email across the table. It was the one they had recovered from the backup server. Jason's eyes scanned the text, the part about the old man losing it. The gray pallor Evelyn had seen earlier returned with a vengeance. "This is an illegally obtained private communication," Sterling Vance interrupted, his voice booming. "I advise my client not to answer." "It was obtained via a court-ordered subpoena of the Carter Development servers, Sterling." "It's as legal as the deed to this building," Sofia snapped. She turned back to Jason. "In this email, you tell your sister, Melissa, that you need the papers signed because the bank is going to take the Houston project." "Which bank, Jason? Was it the one that refused you a loan because your credit was shot? Or was it the bank you created, Lone Star Capital, to wash your father's equity into your own pockets?" Jason opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at his lawyer, but Vance was staring at the floor. "You didn't just lie to your father," Evelyn said, breaking her silence. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a cold wind. "You used his confusion. You watched him slip away, and instead of holding his hand, you put a pen in it. You're not a traditionalist, Jason. You're a thief." 2 nights after the deposition, the Texas sky turned a bruised, sickly green. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone and wet dust. A dry line storm was moving in from the west. Evelyn was in the barn, checking the remaining cattle, when the power went out. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the low, nervous lowing of the herd. Then, she heard it, the crunch of gravel on the north road. No headlights. Just the sound of a heavy engine. She didn't call the police. She knew the response time in Sterling was 40 minutes on a good day, and tonight the roads would be blocked by fallen limbs. She grabbed her shotgun and a heavy-duty flashlight. A truck was idling near the Clear Fork River pump station, the heart of the ranch's irrigation system. Two men were working in the shadows, their silhouettes illuminated by occasional flashes of heat lightning. "Drop it!" Evelyn shouted, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the rain. The men froze. One was Kyle. He looked disheveled, his expensive California clothes soaked to the skin. In his hand, he held a heavy iron wrench. He had been trying to sabotage the main pump, a move that would have destroyed the ranch's ability to water the cattle during the coming heat wave, forcing an emergency sale. "Evelyn, don't be a hero," Kyle yelled over the rising wind. "The ranch is dead anyway. We just want what's ours before the bank takes it." "This isn't yours." Evelyn stepped closer, the shotgun leveled. "It never was. You didn't sweat for this dirt. You didn't bury your parents in it. You just saw it as a line on a ledger." A second figure stepped out from behind the pump house. It was a man Evelyn didn't recognize, a fixer Jason had sent to finish what the lawyers couldn't. He moved toward her, his hand reaching for something in his belt. Crack. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Evelyn's gun. Louis stood at the edge of the pump house, his old hunting rifle pointed at the sky. Behind him, three other ranch hands emerged from the darkness, their faces grim. "The lady told you to leave," Louis said. Kyle looked at the line of men who had worked this land for decades, who had seen Evelyn's kindness and the stepchildren's cruelty. He dropped the wrench into the mud. The vultures had finally realized that the sparrow had a flock. The gritty legal thriller ended not with a bang, but with the sound of a judge's gavel. A week later, Sofia Reyes presented a final, undeniable piece of evidence. Marcus Thorne, the lawyer who had helped draft the fraudulent will, had turned state's evidence. Facing disbarment and prison time, he had handed over the ledgers for Lone Star Capital. The documents proved a systematic pattern of asset stripping. Jason hadn't just been taking loans, he had been funneling ranch profits through shell companies to hide them from the IRS, leaving the debts on the ranch and the cash in his own accounts. In the judge's chambers, the settlement was dictated. The will, declared null and void due to fraud and lack of capacity. The debt, Lone Star Capital's liens were wiped out. The punishment, Jason and Melissa were ordered to pay restitution to the estate, totaling $1.2 million. Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps in Sterling. The sun was out, and the air was crisp. Sofia stood beside her, looking exhausted but triumphant. "What will you do with the restitution money?" Sofia asked. Evelyn looked toward the horizon, where the lazy began. "I'm going to start a trust. For the families of the men who work that land. And I think," she smiled, looking at Sofia, "I'm going to need a permanent legal advisor. Someone who knows how to fight vultures." Sofia grinned. "I think I can find someone." Evelyn Carter turned toward her truck. She was no longer just a widow, she was the architect of a new legacy, one built not on blood, but on the unshakable truth of the land. The Texas sky over the lazy was no longer a bruised purple. Today, it was a brilliant, searing blue, the kind of sky that looked like it had been scrubbed clean by the storm. 1 year had passed since the gavel fell in Fort Worth. Evelyn Carter stood on her porch, but she wasn't gripping the railing with white knuckles anymore. In her hand was a mug of black coffee, and on her lap sat a stack of documents, not foreclosure notices, but conservation easements. The ranch had changed. The Lazy sign at the front gate had been repainted, but below it, a new smaller sign had been added, the Garcia Carter Cooperative. Evelyn had kept her word. She hadn't just saved the land, she had restructured it. Recognizing that Luis and his family were the true marrow of the ranch, she had legally transitioned a portion of the operating profits into a trust for the ranch hands. It was a chosen family legacy, one that the law couldn't easily dismantle. The world had not been kind to Jason Carter. Without the ranch to use as a piggy bank, his Houston developments had collapsed like a house of cards. The Lone Star Capital scandal had triggered an IRS audit that stripped him of his remaining assets. He was currently navigating a messy bankruptcy, his politician's paunch replaced by the hollow look of a man who had finally run out of people to betray. Melissa had retreated to a small apartment in Austin, her Italian handbags sold off to pay her mounting legal fees. Kyle was back in California, reportedly working for a rideshare company, the entrepreneurial spark extinguished by the cold reality of a life without a safety net. They didn't call. They didn't write. And for the first time in 25 years, Evelyn felt no guilt about it. The old bunkhouse had been transformed. It now boasted high-speed satellite internet, a wall of law books, and a sleek glass door. Sofia Reyes had accepted the offer. She split her time between the city and the ranch, handling land use cases for the surrounding community. She had become the widow's lawyer, a title she wore with more pride than any corporate partner badge. Sofia walked across the yard, her boots kicking up the familiar red dust. "The water rights filing is finished, Evelyn," Sofia said, leaning against the porch post. "The Clear Fork River is protected. No developer can touch a drop for the next 50 years. Evelyn nodded, looking out at the river. "Hank always told me to keep the land happy. He just forgot that you can't have a happy land if the people on it are being lied to." Evelyn walked down the steps and headed toward the small family cemetery. She stood by Hank's grave. She didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet, distant pity. "I kept it, Hank," she whispered. "But I kept it my way." She reached down and pulled a stray weed from the base of the headstone. She realized then that she was no longer living in the part one of someone else's story. She wasn't the widow, the sparrow, or the victim. As she walked back toward the farmhouse, the sound of a tractor hummed in the distance. Luis waved from the north pasture. The cattle were fat, the grass was tall, and the debts were gone. The legacy was no longer a burden of the past. It was a bridge to the future. Evelyn Carter took a deep breath of the sun-baked air, turned her back on the shadows, and walked toward the light of her own making. The end.